To put this gospel into context, the conversation about Jesus' suffering and death is enclosed in a dazzling foreshadowing of the resurrection. God affirms Jesus' identity, the disciples are stunned, speechless, and Jesus resumes his mission. The Holy Gospel according to Luke. Now, about 8 days after Jesus foretells of his death and resurrection, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw 2 men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men who stood with Jesus. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. When he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my Son, my chosen. Listen to him." The Gospel of the Lord. In our Old Testament reading today, we hear an odd story about how Moses' face shines when he is in the presence of God. Back then, ancient people believed that if you had a face-to-face encounter with God, if you saw God's face, that would mean certain death. But on this mountain, God makes God's self accessible to Moses in a new way. And every time that Moses goes up on that mountain and experiences this closeness with God, Moses comes down the mountain changed, his face shining with a God-like glow. Now, our gospel reading for today builds upon this story. We hear that Jesus, Peter, James, and John make their way up a mountain to pray, perhaps also seeking an intentional time of closeness with God. Then all of a sudden, while they are praying, Jesus' clothes turn dazzling white, and his face changes as well. Only this time, the shining radiance doesn't come externally, but rather internally from within him. Jesus is not experiencing closeness with God. Jesus is God. And the disciples realize that Jesus is God there with them, close enough for them to touch. God is with them right there on that mountain. And God has been with them, walking and talking and traveling with them up that mountain. And God will continue to be with them as they descend down that mountain and head towards the uncertainty and grief and pain and loss that most certainly await them. And we know that it does because immediately before this passage, and then again immediately after, Jesus foretells of his death. He knows that it is coming. The road down the mountain is the road to Jerusalem. It is the road of our Lenten journey. It is a road that no matter what, unmistakably brings us to and dead ends at the foot of the cross. But perhaps there is some gospel grace in this for us. That the God who is dazzling and shiny and dwells close to us on the mountaintop is the same God who goes straight down the mountain to enter into all of our human pain and suffering as well. Jesus amplifies and extends the closeness of God so that it's felt not only in the mountain highs of life, but also even and especially in those valley lows as well. For yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for you are with me. You are with me. Through Jesus, God is with us, with you, with me, with our world, with all of creation, in all the circumstances that we face, even and especially in those valleys. Because God cares very deeply about what happens in the valleys of our lives and the valleys of the life of the world. I've been holding on to that promise this week as I've seen those horrifying images come out of Ukraine, as I've prayed and grieved with very close friends of mine as they navigate an unprecedented family tragedy, as I've sat on my couch just looking at the wall thinking, what is this world coming to? And yet, the promise of this gospel today shines a light of hope into those dark places, not eliminating pain or erasing hardship, but providing assurance that someone is with me, with us, with the world, accompanying us through the midst of these things, who will never let go of us. Someone who is actively working to bring light out of darkness, to bring hope out of despair, to bring beauty out of brokenness, to bring life out of death. Someone who takes that dead-end road of the cross and transforms it into something new out of an empty tomb. That someone is the risen Christ, the living God, the center and the focus of the greatest love story of all time. God's love for God's people. This story of a God who over and over and over again comes to rescue God's people, to draw close to them, and to leave on their faces a God-like glow. The disciples wanted to stay on that mountain and bask in that God-like glow. But Jesus had more ministry ahead of him. And in fact, the first thing he does when Jesus descends down the mountain is to shine light on a young boy who is demon-possessed, to cast out an unclean spirit, and to heal that boy and change his life forever. Just like the disciples' lives after an encounter with God are changed forever, just like our lives and the lives of the faithful are changed forever when we encounter God. When we gather together here, online, wherever we are for worship, when we encounter the living Christ through word and song and sacrament, when we are nourished by God, and then in turn care and nourish one another in this beloved community, when we feel filled up by the risen Christ, then our lives are changed. Our faces glow with a God-like glow. And Christ's presence is with us as we head out from this place, down the mountain. Christ's face is with us, beside us, behind us, and ahead of us. We too experience this closeness of God. Our faces change with a God-like glow, so that we can then shift our faces towards others who are suffering, so that we can shine the light of Christ as best we can, and lean into the gospel grace that carries us as we face the valleys of tomorrow with Christ by our side. Amen.